The hallway was eerily quiet now, except for the soft rustle of papers and the faint squeak of Mr. Lewis's rubber-soled shoes as he tried to steady himself. His usual smile had vanished, replaced with a wince of pain. The teacher, Miss Carter, knelt beside him, her face a mix of concern and frustration. She was one of the newer staff members, but she had quickly earned a reputation for standing up for what was right. She wasn't the kind of person to turn a blind eye, especially when someone was being mistreated. "Mr. Lewis, are you okay?" she asked gently, helping him to his feet. He nodded, brushing off the dust from his uniform, though it was clear he was hurting. "I'm fine," he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "It's just a little spill. I'll clean it up." Miss Carter wasn't convinced. She glanced down the hallway, her sharp eyes scanning every corner. The faint sound of muffled laughter caught her attention. She turned her head sharply, and that's when she saw them. 3 boys huddled near the lockers, trying to stifle their giggles. Their faces were flushed, not with guilt, but with the thrill of getting away with something they thought was clever. She recognized them immediately. Tyler, the ringleader, was a senior known for his cocky attitude and tendency to push boundaries. He had a way of making trouble without getting caught, always skating just under the radar. His sidekicks, Ryan and Caleb, followed him everywhere, more than willing to participate in whatever mischief he cooked up. They were the type of kids who thrived on attention, whether it was positive or negative. Miss Carter's expression hardened. She stood up straight, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as she walked toward them. The boys froze, their laughter dying in their throats. Tyler tried to play it cool, leaning casually against a locker as if he had nothing to do with what had just happened, but the flicker of panic in his eyes gave him away. "Do you think this is funny?" Miss Carter's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made the boys squirm. Tyler shrugged, feigning innocence. "We didn't do anything, Miss Carter." "Really?" she said, crossing her arms. "Because I heard your laughter and I saw the mess. Do you want to explain how Mr. Lewis ended up on the floor?" Ryan and Caleb exchanged nervous glances, their confidence wavering. Tyler, however, wasn't ready to back down. "It's not our fault if he slipped," he said, his tone dripping with defiance. "Maybe he should be more careful." Miss Carter's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, Mr. Lewis stepped forward. "It's okay, Miss Carter," he said softly. "I don't want any trouble. Let's just leave it." But she wasn't about to let it go. She turned back to the boys, her eyes narrowing. "You 3 stay here. I'm going to get the principal." As she walked away, Tyler muttered under his breath, "What's the big deal? He's just a janitor." Those words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Mr. Lewis flinched, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he bent down to pick up his mop, his movements slow and deliberate. The boys watched him for a moment before turning their attention back to each other, their whispers too quiet to hear. What they didn't realize was that their actions had been noticed by more than just Miss Carter. A few students who had lingered in the hallway had seen everything. Some of them looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot as if debating whether to speak up. Others just turned away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. After all, it was easier to stay silent than to get involved. But one student, a junior named Emma, couldn't ignore what had happened. She had always admired Mr. Lewis for his kindness and work ethic. He wasn't just a janitor to her. He was someone who genuinely cared about the school and the people in it. She had seen him fix broken lockers, carry heavy loads of supplies without complaint, and even comfort students who were having a bad day. Seeing him treated so poorly made her stomach churn. Emma clenched her fists, her heart pounding as she made a decision. She stepped forward, her voice shaky but firm. "Why do you have to be so mean?" she asked, her eyes locking onto Tyler. The boys turned to her, startled. Tyler raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "What's your problem?" he asked. "It's none of your business." "It is my business," Emma shot back, her voice gaining strength. "Mr. Lewis doesn't deserve this. He's done nothing but help this school, and you treat him like dirt. What's wrong with you?" Ryan and Caleb looked uncomfortable, shifting their gaze to the floor, but Tyler wasn't ready to back down. "Relax," he said, rolling his eyes. "It was just a joke." "Yeah. Well, it's not funny," Emma said, her voice trembling with anger. "And one day, you're going to realize how wrong this is. You can't keep treating people like they don't matter." Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, Miss Carter returned with the principal, Mr. Harris, in tow. The look on Mr. Harris' face was enough to make the boys shrink back against the lockers. "What's going on here?" Mr. Harris asked, his voice stern. Miss Carter quickly explained the situation, sparing no detail. Mr. Harris' expression grew darker with every word. When she finished, he turned to the boys, his arms crossed. "Is this true?" he demanded. Tyler hesitated, but before he could lie, Ryan blurted out, "It was Tyler's idea. We didn't mean for Mr. Lewis to get hurt." Tyler glared at him, but the damage was done. Mr. Harris sighed, shaking his head. "This behavior is unacceptable. All three of you will be spending the next week in detention, and you'll be writing letters of apology to Mr. Lewis." The boys groaned, but Mr. Harris wasn't finished. "And I'll be calling your parents to let them know what happened. Maybe they can help you understand the importance of respect." As Mr. Harris escorted the boys to his office, Emma approached Mr. Lewis. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He smiled weakly, nodding. "I'll be fine. Thank you for standing up for me." Emma returned his smile, though her heart still felt heavy. She couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change, not just for Mr. Lewis, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. And as she walked to her next class, she made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't let this be the end of the story. The air in the principal's office was thick with tension as Tyler, Ryan, and Caleb sat across from Mr. Harris. The boys shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding eye contact. Tyler, for all his bravado in the hallway, was now unusually quiet. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, and he didn't like it. Mr. Harris, meanwhile, sat with his hands folded on the desk, his sharp gaze fixed on the three of them. "Do you boys have any idea how serious this is?" Mr. Harris finally asked, his tone even but firm. "This isn't just about a prank gone wrong. This is about how you treat people who deserve respect and kindness." Ryan opened his mouth to say something, but Mr. Harris held up a hand to stop him. "I don't want excuses. What you did was hurtful and dangerous. Mr. Lewis could have been seriously injured. Is that how you want to be remembered? As the kids who hurt someone for a cheap laugh?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, the boys seemed to feel the weight of what they had done. Caleb stared at his hands, Ryan fidgeted with his hoodie strings, and even Tyler seemed at a loss for words. Mr. Harris let the silence linger before continuing. "You're going to spend the next week in detention, but this isn't just about punishment," he said. "You're going to spend that time helping Mr. Lewis with his work. Maybe then you'll understand how hard he works for this school and how much he cares about this community." The boy's eyes widened at this. Tyler's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He could tell that Mr. Harris wasn't going to budge, and deep down, he knew there was no talking his way out of this one. As the boys left the office, they exchanged uneasy glances. None of them spoke as they walked down the hallway, their earlier confidence completely deflated. Tyler, who usually had a sarcastic remark for every situation, kept his head down. For once, he wasn't sure what to say. Meanwhile, back in the janitor's closet, Mr. Lewis was quietly putting away his cleaning supplies. His arms still throbbed from the fall, but he didn't complain. He had learned a long time ago that life wasn't always fair. Growing up, he had faced his share of challenges, and over the years he had developed a thick skin. But that didn't mean the words and actions of others didn't hurt. As he closed the closet door, he spotted Emma standing nearby, her face etched with concern. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Mr. Lewis, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened," she said softly. I know it's not my fault, but I just feel bad. Mr. Lewis gave her a small, warm smile. Thank you, Emma. That means a lot to me. But you don't have to apologize for what others do. You stood up for me, and that's more than enough. Emma nodded, though the guilt still lingered. I just don't understand why people have to be so mean, she said. You've always been so nice to everyone. You don't deserve this. Mr. Lewis sighed, leaning against the wall. Sometimes people act out because they don't know any better. Maybe they're going through something themselves, or maybe they just haven't learned the value of kindness yet. But that doesn't mean we should let it get to us. We just have to keep being who we are. Emma thought about his words as she walked away, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more to Mr. Lewis, more to the boys, and more to the way people treated each other in general. She decided then and there that she would do whatever she could to make a difference, even if it was just a small one. The next day, the boys began their detention with Mr. Lewis. It was clear from the start that none of them wanted to be there. Tyler leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, Ryan shuffled his feet, and Caleb stared at the ground. Mr. Lewis, however, greeted them with the same calm demeanor he always had. All right, boys, he said, handing each of them a mop. Today we're cleaning the cafeteria floors. It's not glamorous, but it's important work. Let's get to it. The boys groaned but didn't argue. As they worked, they couldn't help but notice how much effort Mr. Lewis put into his job. He didn't just do the bare minimum. He took pride in making sure everything was spotless. It was something they had never really thought about before, and it made them feel a little ashamed. As the days went on, the boys started to see Mr. Lewis in a new light. They learned that he had been working at the school for over 20 years, not because he had to, but because he genuinely cared about the students and staff. They found out that he often stayed late to help with school events, and that he had even used his own money to buy supplies when the school budget fell short. One afternoon, as they were finishing up in the gym, Caleb hesitated before speaking. Mr. Lewis, he said, his voice quiet, I'm sorry for what we did. It wasn't right. The other boys looked at him, surprised, but Mr. Lewis just nodded. Thank you, Caleb, he said. I appreciate that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Ryan and Tyler exchanged a glance, and after a moment, Ryan spoke up. Yeah, me too. I'm sorry. Tyler was the last to speak. He shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. I didn't mean for you to get hurt, he said finally. I guess. I didn't really think about how it would affect you. I'm sorry. Mr. Lewis smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Apologies accepted. But remember, it's not just about saying you're sorry. It's about learning from your mistakes and making sure you do better next time. As the boys left the gym that day, they felt a little lighter. They still had a lot to learn, but for the first time, they were starting to understand the importance of treating people with respect. And while they couldn't undo what they had done, they knew they could make things right moving forward. Back in the hallway, Emma watched them from a distance, a small smile on her face. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt hopeful. Change didn't happen overnight, but it started with small steps, and sometimes all it took was one moment of kindness to spark something bigger. As the week of detention continued, the boys found themselves immersed in a world they had previously ignored. Cleaning hallways, scrubbing cafeteria tables, and sorting through the endless mess left behind by hundreds of students wasn't just physically exhausting, it was humbling. Each task forced them to slow down and observe the effort it took to maintain the school they had taken for granted. They started to notice things they had never paid attention to before, like how Mr. Lewis would greet every student with a warm smile, or how he'd stop to pick up litter in the parking lot even after a long day. Despite their initial reluctance, something began to shift in their attitudes. Caleb, the quietest of the group, started to ask Mr. Lewis questions during their work. He learned that Mr. Lewis had a family, a wife and 2 daughters, and that he took pride in his job because it was a way to provide for them. Caleb couldn't help but compare Mr. Lewis's selflessness to his own tendency to coast through life without much thought for others. It was a stark contrast that lingered in his mind. Ryan, on the other hand, started noticing how other students treated Mr. Lewis. While some were polite, others still looked past him as though he were invisible. One afternoon, a group of freshmen barged through the hallway, laughing loudly, and knocked over a trash can that Mr. Lewis had just emptied. Without hesitation, they ran off, leaving Mr. Lewis to clean up the mess. Ryan clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger he couldn't quite explain. For the first time, he felt protective of the man he'd once mocked, and it unsettled him. Tyler remained the most resistant to change, but even he wasn't completely immune to the experience. One evening, as they were cleaning up after a basketball game, Tyler overheard Mr. Lewis talking to the coach. The coach thanked him for staying late, and Mr. Lewis replied with a humble, "It's no trouble. I just want to make sure the kids have a good experience here." Tyler pretended not to hear, but the words stuck with him. Why would someone care so much about a school where they were treated with so little respect? The question gnawed at him, though he wasn't ready to admit it. Meanwhile, Emma wasn't letting the situation fade into the background. She had taken it upon herself to start a small campaign to recognize the unsung heroes of the school, starting with Mr. Lewis. She rallied a few friends to help her create posters and flyers that highlighted the hard work of the custodial staff. The posters featured simple messages like, "Thank you, Mr. Lewis," and "Appreciate those who keep our school running." Emma wasn't sure how much of a difference it would make, but she hoped it would at least open people's eyes. The first day the posters went up, Mr. Lewis noticed them as he was making his rounds. He stopped in his tracks, staring at the bright colors and bold letters. A lump formed in his throat, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. When he finally saw Emma later that day, he smiled and said, "You didn't have to do all this, but thank you. It means more than you know." But not everyone was thrilled about the newfound attention. A few students began to grumble that the posters were unnecessary. "Why does everyone care so much about the janitor all of a sudden?" One boy sneered in the cafeteria, loud enough for Emma to hear. She turned to face him, her voice steady but firm. "Because he's a person who deserves respect, just like anyone else. If you don't see that, maybe you're the one who needs to change." As word of Emma's efforts spread, the atmosphere at school began to shift ever so slightly. Some students started saying thank you to Mr. Lewis when they passed him in the hall. Teachers began to acknowledge his contributions during morning announcements. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was enough to make Mr. Lewis feel seen in a way he hadn't before. For Tyler, Ryan, and Caleb, the changes at school mirrored the internal changes they were grappling with. Caleb started spending more time with Emma, helping her with her campaign and finding a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. Ryan began to distance himself from the more toxic influences in his life, realizing how much their attitudes had shaped his own. Tyler, though still guarded, found himself thinking more about his actions and their consequences. The tension, however, wasn't entirely resolved. There was still an undercurrent of resentment among some students who didn't understand why Mr. Lewis was suddenly the center of attention. And for Tyler, the guilt of what they had done lingered, even as he tried to bury it. He couldn't shake the memory of Mr. Lewis falling in the hallway, the sound of the mop bucket clattering to the floor, and the laughter that had followed. It haunted him in a way he couldn't explain, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. One evening, as detention was wrapping up, Tyler found himself alone with Mr. Lewis in the storage room. The air felt heavy, and Tyler knew he couldn't leave without saying something. He hesitated, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, before finally speaking. "Mr. Lewis," he began, his voice low, "I know we said we were sorry, but I don't think I really meant it before. I do now. I'm really sorry for what we did." Mr. Lewis turned to look at him, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he said, "Thank you, Tyler. I appreciate that. But the real question is, what are you going to do differently moving forward?" Tyler didn't have an answer right away, but the question stayed with him as he left the room. He realized that apologies were only the first step. Change would take more effort, more courage. And for the first time, he felt like he was ready to try. The week of detention might have been over, but the story was far from finished. The boys still had a long way to go, and the school still had lessons to learn about kindness and respect. But somewhere in the midst of all the tension and uncertainty, a spark of hope began to grow. And while no one could predict what would happen next, one thing was certain: the choices they made from here on out would define not just their future, but the future of everyone around them. The changes in the school's atmosphere were subtle but undeniable. Emma's campaign continued to gain traction, and the students' small gestures of kindness toward Mr. Lewis became more frequent. Yet, beneath the surface, tensions were still brewing. Not everyone embraced the shift. A few students, mostly those who had always dismissed the janitor as insignificant, whispered among themselves, mocking the newfound attention. They couldn't understand why Mr. Lewis, someone they saw as merely the janitor, deserved such recognition. Their whispers grew louder, and their resistance became more apparent. Tyler, Ryan, and Caleb found themselves caught in a strange in-between space. They were no longer the boys they had been, but they weren't entirely sure who they were becoming. For Tyler, especially, the weight of his past actions was beginning to feel unbearable. He couldn't shake the memory of the day Mr. Lewis had fallen. Every night, as he tried to sleep, he'd hear the echo of his own laughter and see the hurt in Mr. Lewis's eyes. It was as if the guilt was following him, refusing to let go until he confronted it head-on. One afternoon, the tension reached a boiling point. A group of students decided to tear down some of Emma's posters. They laughed as they ripped the bright papers from the walls, crumpling them and tossing them into the trash. Emma saw them from across the hall, her heart sinking. She rushed over, her voice trembling but firm. "What are you doing?" "Those posters are there to remind everyone to show some respect." One of the boys sneered. "Respect? For a janitor? Come on, Emma. Don't you think this is all a little over the top?" Emma didn't back down. "No, I don't. And maybe if you took a second to think about how much he does for this school, you wouldn't either." The hallway fell silent as more students gathered, watching the confrontation unfold. Emma's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the boy looked like he might argue back. But something in her unwavering gaze made him hesitate. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving the crumpled posters behind. Ryan and Caleb, who had witnessed the scene from a distance, felt a surge of anger. They hadn't realized how deep the resentment ran among some of their classmates. For Caleb, especially, it was a wake-up call. He had always followed the crowd, but now he saw how destructive that could be. He and Ryan helped Emma gather the torn posters, smoothing them out as best they could. Meanwhile, Tyler was dealing with his own internal battle. That same day, during their detention duties, he found himself alone in the cafeteria with Mr. Lewis. The room was quiet, except for the sound of chairs being stacked and floors being swept. Tyler glanced at Mr. Lewis, who was busy cleaning a stubborn stain on one of the tables. "Mr. Lewis," Tyler began hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" Mr. Lewis looked up, his expression kind but cautious. "Of course, Tyler. What's on your mind?" "Why do you still care so much?" "About this school, about the students, about everything. After the way you've been treated, I don't think I could do it." Mr. Lewis paused, setting down his cleaning cloth. He leaned against the table, his eyes thoughtful. "It's not always easy," he admitted, "but I try to focus on the good. There are always going to be people who don't understand, who don't appreciate what you do. But then there are people like Emma, like Caleb, who remind me why I started this job in the first place. It's not about the recognition. It's about doing what's right, even when no one's watching." Tyler didn't know what to say. He felt a lump rise in his throat, and for a moment, he thought he might cry. He quickly turned away, pretending to busy himself with a stack of chairs. But Mr. Lewis's words stayed with him, resonating in a way he hadn't expected. As the week progressed, the tension continued to build. Emma's campaign had sparked a divide among the students. While many supported her efforts, others saw it as unnecessary or even annoying. The whispers of discontent grew louder, and it became clear that a confrontation was inevitable. Tyler didn't know what to say. He felt a lump rise in his throat, and for a moment he thought he might cry. He quickly turned away, pretending to busy himself with a stack of chairs. But Mr. Lewis's words stayed with him, resonating in a way he hadn't expected. As the week progressed, the tension continued to build. Emma's campaign had sparked a divide among the students. While many supported her efforts, others saw it as unnecessary or even annoying. The whispers of discontent grew louder, and it became clear that a confrontation was inevitable. The breaking point came during a school assembly. The principal had invited Mr. Lewis to the stage to thank him for his years of service. As he walked up, there was a mix of applause and murmurs from the crowd. Mr. Lewis stood at the microphone, visibly uncomfortable but deeply moved by the gesture. He began to speak, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've worked at this school for a long time," he said, "and in that time, I've seen the best and the worst of what people are capable of. But what gives me hope is seeing the kindness and respect that so many of you have shown recently. It reminds me that no matter how tough things get, there's always room for change." Before he could continue, a loud voice from the back of the auditorium interrupted. "Why should we care? He's just the janitor." The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. It was one of the students who had been tearing down the posters earlier in the week. Emma stood up, her face flushed with anger. "He's not just anything," she said, her voice loud and clear. "He's someone who works harder than most of us ever will, and he deserves our respect. If you can't see that, maybe you need to take a good look at yourself." The tension in the room was palpable. Mr. Lewis looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. He didn't say anything, but his expression spoke volumes. It was a mixture of gratitude, pain, and quiet strength. As the assembly ended, the students filed out of the auditorium, the air thick with unresolved tension. Tyler, Ryan, and Caleb lingered behind, each lost in their own thoughts. They knew that the moment of truth was approaching. Whatever happened next would define not only their relationship with Mr. Lewis, but also their own sense of integrity. The stage was set, the lines had been drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. The boys had a choice to make, and the weight of it pressed heavily on their shoulders. The question wasn't just about what they would do, it was about who they wanted to be. And as they walked out of the auditorium, the answer still hung in the balance. The silence that followed the assembly was unsettling. The usual chatter and laughter in the hallways had been replaced with an uneasy tension that clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. For Tyler, Ryan, and Caleb, the weight of everything was becoming unbearable. They couldn't ignore the fact that their actions or inaction had set so much of this into motion. But just as they began to consider making things right, something unexpected happened, pulling the rug out from under everyone. The day after the assembly, rumors began circulating. Whispers about Mr. Lewis spread like wildfire, growing more exaggerated with each telling. At first, it was just small things, claims that he had a criminal record, or that he didn't even have a proper education. But soon, the stories turned darker. Someone had supposedly found old photographs of him involved in some scandal. No one could verify the claims, but that didn't stop the gossip from spreading. Emma was furious. She confronted the students she suspected of starting the rumors, but they denied everything. "You can't just make up lies about someone to tear them down," she snapped. "This is about more than Mr. Lewis. It's about the kind of people we want to be." But it didn't stop. Anonymous notes appeared in lockers, scrawled with accusations and insults. Someone even went so far as to write fraud across one of Emma's posters. It was clear that this wasn't just about Mr. Lewis anymore. The students who had started the rumors were escalating their efforts, trying to discredit him entirely. Tyler watched it all unfold, his stomach in knots. He couldn't understand why things had gone so far. The guilt he felt about his role in all of this was eating away at him, but he didn't know how to fix it. One afternoon, As he walked past a group of students whispering about Mr. Lewis, he snapped. "Do you even know what you're talking about?" he demanded, his voice louder than he'd intended. "Or are you just repeating what you heard because it's easier than thinking for yourself?" The group stared at him, surprised by his outburst. Tyler didn't wait for a response. He stormed down the hallway, his heart pounding. For the first time, he felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. Meanwhile, Emma and Caleb were working together to figure out where the rumors had started. They combed through social media posts and confronted anyone who seemed involved, but it was like chasing shadows. The lies had taken on a life of their own, and it felt like they were fighting an uphill battle. The students listened in stunned silence. Many of them had believed the rumors without question, and now they felt the weight of their complicity. One by one, they began to stand, offering apologies to Mr. Lewis, who stood at the front of the room with tears in his eyes. It was a moment of redemption, not just for him, but for the school as a whole. But just when it seemed like the story had reached its resolution, an unexpected twist emerged. After the assembly, Emma found an anonymous note slipped into her locker. It read, "You think you've uncovered the truth, but you don't know the whole story. Be careful who you trust." The note sent a chill down her spine. She shared it with Caleb and Tyler, who were equally unsettled. They couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still trying to manipulate the situation, but they had no idea who or why. As they walked out of the school that day, the weight of the note lingered in their minds. The battle for justice might have been won, but the war for the truth was far from over. The note in Emma's locker left her feeling uneasy, but she knew she couldn't let fear hold her back. Together with Caleb and Tyler, they decided to keep their eyes and ears open. For the time being, however, it seemed the worst was behind them. The school had rallied around Mr. Lewis, and the students who had once mocked and ignored him were now offering help and kindness. It was a transformation that felt almost surreal, as though a heavy shadow had been lifted from the hallways. Mr. Lewis, too, seemed lighter. Though he was hesitant at first, he began to share more about himself with the students. He told stories from his days as a teacher, moments that made him laugh and ones that had left an impact on him. Slowly but surely, he found his place not just as the janitor everyone had once overlooked, but as a respected figure who had something valuable to offer. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the anonymous note was more than a simple warning. It gnawed at the back of her mind, especially in the days following the assembly. She began to notice small, odd things. A few students whispered among themselves when she passed by, quickly quieting down when she looked their way. A few of her posters for the student council elections disappeared from the bulletin board, only to reappear torn or defaced. Though she couldn't prove it, she had a strong suspicion that someone was still upset about how things had played out. Meanwhile, Caleb and Tyler worked on rebuilding their own reputations. Tyler, who had been among those mocking Mr. Lewis at the beginning, took it upon himself to make amends. He stayed late after school one evening to help Mr. Lewis clean the cafeteria, quietly apologizing as they worked. "I was wrong," he said simply, "and I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I want you to know I'm sorry." Mr. Lewis smiled softly, wiping down a table. "Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook," he said. "It's about giving yourself peace. I forgive you, Tyler, not because you deserve it, but because I choose to." Those words stayed with Tyler. They marked the beginning of a shift in him, one that Emma noticed in the way he carried himself. He wasn't perfect, no one was, but he was trying, and that meant something. The weeks passed, and the tension that had gripped the school began to fade. Emma focused on her studies and her campaign for student council president. Caleb supported her every step of the way, and Tyler found himself helping out in unexpected ways. The three of them had formed an unlikely bond, one forged in the fires of conflict and redemption. One afternoon, as Emma walked to her car, she spotted Mr. Lewis sitting on a bench near the school's garden. He was reading a book, his expression calm and peaceful. She hesitated for a moment before walking over to him. "Mr. Lewis," she said, "can I ask you something?" He looked up, smiling. Of course. Why did you stay? She asked. After everything that happened, you could have left. No one would have blamed you. Mr. Lewis closed his book, leaning back against the bench. I've thought about that a lot, he admitted. It would have been easier to leave, to start fresh somewhere new. But running away doesn't solve anything. And besides, there's something special about this place, about the people here. Even when it's hard, I believe in second chances, for them and for myself. His words stayed with Emma long after their conversation ended. They reminded her of the importance of resilience and the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's not the easy choice. As the school year drew to a close, the changes in the school community became more apparent. Students who had once ignored Mr. Lewis now greeted him warmly in the hallways. Acts of kindness became more common, small gestures that slowly rebuilt the trust and respect that had been so badly damaged. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, and not everyone had learned the same lessons, but it was a start. Emma won the student council election, and in her acceptance speech, she made a point to thank Mr. Lewis for teaching her the value of empathy and courage. Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room, she said. It's about listening, understanding, and lifting others up. The note in her locker remained a mystery, but over time, Emma chose not to dwell on it. Whether it was a warning or a lingering attempt to cause fear, she refused to let it define her actions. The truth, she realized, was that change would always have its challenges. There would always be people resistant to it, people who clung to old ways of thinking. But that didn't mean the effort wasn't worth it. On the last day of school, as students poured out of the building for the summer break, Emma saw Mr. Lewis standing by the doors, holding a broom in one hand and waving with the other. She walked over to him, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you for everything," she said. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thank you, Emma, for seeing me when no one else did." As she walked away, Emma felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been transformative. The events of the past few months had changed not just the school, but everyone involved, including herself. The story ended not with a dramatic revelation or a perfect resolution, but with the quiet understanding that change is a process, not a moment. The lessons learned would stay with them all, shaping their choices and actions in the years to come. And as the school settled into the rhythm of summer, the seeds of empathy and kindness planted in those turbulent months began to take root, promising a brighter future for everyone.